This podcast is produced by the Center for Deployment Psychology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. The views expressed are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. In addition, references to any specific companies, products, processes, or services does not necessarily constitute or imply endorsement by the Uniformed Services University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Welcome to CDP's podcast, Practical for Your Practice,
where we give you actionable intel to support what you do.
One colleague to another.
Welcome back to Practical for Your Practice. I am Dr. Jenna Ermold, Assistant Director of Online Training, Telehealth, and Technology. And I'm joined by my podcast partner in crime, Dr. Kevin Holloway. How you doing, Kevin?
I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. How are you?
I'm good. And I'm really kind of excited today because a very long time colleague friend has joined us today to have a conversation about a topic very near and dear to my heart, which is military culture. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Shannon McCaslin to the podcast. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
And Shannon, we are going to let you do just that thumbnail sketch intro of who you are and kind of what you're doing so folks know where your perspective is coming from.
Sure. So, so I'm a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm currently at the National Center for PTSD in the VA healthcare system. And there I work on various education and training products and initiatives. One we'll be talking about today, the Community Provider Toolkit. I'd like to say, too, that anything I say today is really from my perspective, and the views I express here don't necessarily reflect those of the U.S. government or the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Awesome. And I was trying to think back, Shannon, to when we met and how we met. And I think it was in the context of developing the very large 4-part military culture for healthcare professionals course, and kind of how that sort of played into the toolkit. Is that your memory? Is that how we crossed paths?
You know, it's been a while, Jenna. So it's I'm trying
like
to
10
recall
years.
myself.
Yeah,
it's been a long time. I think it might have been a little bit more convoluted than that. I received a small amount of funding for a pilot project focused on military culture, and as part of that process, right, I brought in our colleague, Dr. Patricia Watson, our beloved colleague, and so we met through that process. And I believe that you and she had been just wrapping up that 4-piece course, and we're about to launch it, maybe, and so we connected through that, and then I think she may have connected us, and we all presented together a couple times.
That's right.
And I pulled you into some of these other educational products that we were developing, your expertise. And so, but it was a while ago. It was. Hard
so
to.
Just for our listeners,
we're still friends all these later. Yeah, sorry.
All right, no, and just for our listeners' benefit, you mentioned this 4-part course a couple times. Is that still available? Is that out there?
It is not.
Okay. so I just want to make sure in case people hear about it and they're like, go looking for it,
Let's talk about that when we get to resources. Because we've got different ones, but it's on pause right now, but we'll circle back to that at the end.
Got it.
But we are today, one of the reasons why we wanted to invite you, Shannon, is we on this podcast, it's practical for your practice. And we talk about, how to help providers feel supported as they do EBPs. We talk about different nuances of EBPs. And obviously a really important part of patient care, and especially if you're wanting to work with military connected clients, is kind of providing that care, but through the lens of military culture, is something that we think is kind of important. But before we talk more about that, from your experience, why is this a topic? Why do you think we're even talking about that? Why does it matter? Or what do you think providers, why do you think providers should spend some time getting a sense of this thing that we call military culture?
Right. So and I think Jenna and Kevin, both of you could speak to this, so feel free to just jump in. But really, I think for me, I really think about being able to make that connection with the patient that sort of opens the door to the rest of treatment, right? You want to sort of be able to establish a therapeutic alliance and rapport that allows you to then move forward with a collaborative relationship with the patient. And if your client or your patient doesn't feel understood, or you are missing a large part of their experience or their perspective, and not really attending to that, I think that, has real implications for engagement, adherence to treatment, things like that.
It's really true. Like, when any of us as providers want to be culturally competent with any culture that we work with. And I think sometimes we forget that being military connected, having that experience is another cultural component that we sometimes forget about if we're not, encountering that all the time. So I think that makes a ton of sense to think about, being competent and sensitive to the unique aspects of that culture that your client may have.
And it's one that's not taught often, in graduate school or in some of the programs that our listeners might have been trained up in. And I think that's changing. I think more schools are incorporating that. But, and I think, we've kind of moved forward with the assumption that the military has a distinct culture. I would say that it definitely has many of the features of what would sort of define a culture. And I agree, Shannon. I think if a military connected client makes it to your door, sometimes there's trepidation. Now I can't say that word. There's concerns. I'll just replace it. Sure. About how well they're going to be understood. And when providers spend the time to maybe understand some of the features that have been reinforced as being part of the military culture, it really, in my mind, the most important thing it does is it puts something into context, right? Like if we put it into the context of culture and we can really evaluate their behaviors, their communication style, kind of look out for certain things, if they're seeming, to defer to you more, is that just a part of their personality, or is this something that's like a learned behavior from being in the military? And how can we offset that if we need them to not do that as much in our clinical decision-making together? There's so many places where I think it can impact care. And I guess, like, how do you think when we're talking about EBPs, and obviously you're with NCPTSD, so certainly with PTSD treatment, what can happen if somebody doesn't get the culture? What are some of the concerns if a provider kind of rushes into an EBP but doesn't sort of consider military culture?
Right. Well, and I think, again, the first thing that comes to mind is really that engagement and sticking with it, and showing up the session. And then also just being willing to do some of the things that you might ask somebody to do in an EBP that can be hard, and they sort of need to have that trust in their provider to really dive in. So those are some things that come to mind. And I would back up a little too, just to go back a second, Jenna, around thinking about training. And I do think, a minority of people in our country really serve in the military, right? And the chances that you're going to encounter a provider, if you're a veteran who hasn't served in the military, doesn't have a lot of knowledge about military culture, are, the odds are pretty good that, you might run into that issue. Yeah. And so, and definitely for myself, I became interested in learning more about military culture when I started working at the VA as a trainee 20 years ago. And that was, and back then we didn't have the online trainings and the, all of these resources that we have today. And right, it was really the veterans who were working at the medical center who were willing to give a talk, right, on their experience.
Absolutely.
And it was extremely valuable. But, certainly, I think we definitely have more comprehensive resources now. So really, if you wanted a more broad education in the area, I think we have those resources and those trainings now that we didn't have back then. So it is really yeah, the trainees are lucky these days.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking the same thing. I did my predoctoral internship at the Portland, Oregon VA in Vision 20 so many years ago. I remember thinking the same thing. It would be really nice. It would be really nice if there were some resources to learn more about these folks and, kind of what they're bringing to the table. And of course, you learn a lot of that by experience too. And like you said, folks that are working there that are willing to share their experience. But man, I've been really impressed with the array of resources that are available now that I kind of wish were available then when I was doing my internship too.
And I'll disclose, when I stepped into the Air Force, that was a huge culture shift for me. There I was in graduate school in Vermont, right? Crunchy granola, Vermont. Next thing I'm wearing all blue and or actually down in Maxwell Air Force Base in my career officer training and panicking. I mean, just panicking because I knew nothing. I mean, I had no history, I had no experience, and so it's kind of trial by fire there. But and obviously I feel like I definitely had an infusion pretty quickly in some aspects of the culture. But that being the case, my experience as a Air Force psychologist and my experience of the culture and of serving as a female, wildly different from another service member in another branch of service and another, military specialty. And so that's, when we talk about these trainings that are available and all of us have been involved in trying to develop those trainings and disseminate those trainings. One of the really tricky bits is there's not like a set of rules. There's not a list of acronyms, like a complete list of acronyms would be enormous. I think sometimes providers are kind of looking for that like cheat sheet. Like if I just know these things, then I get it. Right. And I think one of the things that we've tried to reinforce is that there are features of the military culture that you can kind of understand, or can be learned or kind of read about, and that's great. But there's so much individual difference depending on experience that the real key thing also to do is be respectful in how you ask questions. And ask, don't assume. So just because somebody served, they served in the Marine Corps, well, then that must mean X, Y, and Z, that the person in front of you had their unique military experience and were impacted by the culture differently. And what it really takes is developing being okay with being uncomfortable if you don't know. And then, figuring out respectful ways to ask about experiences so that you can have that complete case formulation, right? Like you understand the why behind some of this stuff. So it's like cool to develop these things and teach these things, but I think at the same time, we're really teaching folks how to be good listeners, respectful in their asking of questions, not making assumptions, and it's kind of like good clinician first. Like, don't forget you're a good clinician just because you're working with the military connection.
Right. Like patient-centered care, right? It's yeah. No, it's true. I mean, there's just so much information out there. Like, it's just I almost feel like there's just no way to learn everything, right? And so it does, like you're saying, Darren, it comes down to being open and curious and respectful and, again, building that relationship that's trusting and comfortable so somebody can share with you and share when you get it wrong, right? Like I've definitely gotten some things wrong, and it's helpful for people to be able to tell me like, well, it wasn't quite my, and I think that's just, it's that therapeutic alliance that I think allows for some of that, being able to go back and forth so.
And it's funny you said, when clients are able to share when you've gotten something wrong, as part of that military culture course that we created, and Patricia Watson, who you referred to earlier, who again was a good friend and colleague of us. One of the cool things we got to do is go around the country to different installations and ask service members, family members, providers, what military culture meant to them. And, we're trying to get at, give us some examples of like when a healthcare provider kind of got it and they integrated that into your care. And we had very few people be able to articulate that and examples of that, but tons of examples of when the provider got it wrong, right? Like when they missed it and when they lost that opportunity or said something that was off-putting. And that was really interesting, right? Like those,
I was just going to say, it's one of my favorite parts of your course that you had. It's definitely interesting to watch and to hear those things that people have heard. Sometimes you're kind of shocked, like, wow.
Sometimes I felt a little called out, I'll be honest.
Actually, we just took what Kevin did clinically,
right.
and we just wrote that out.
Don't do this.
But I think the good news is, there's a way to repair that. One of the things we hear a lot when we're training EBPs even or in consultation is when a military connected client will say, you didn't serve, you don't know what it's like. You didn't experience this. You don't know anything about what happened to me. How can you help me? And I think that's such a hard thing for civilian providers and community providers who haven't had that service experience. It really can feel like, well, yeah, you're right. I can't. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts? Like, what do you tell in consultation? Does that come up for you, or what do you tell folks when that happens? Because I think that's a real concern for a lot of providers who want to do good work with military clients, but they kind of get hit with that.
Well, I think, that's a tough one, because I think sometimes clients won't come out and say that necessarily, but just sort of their stance in the room is a little more defended maybe. And so, I think in those situations, really being clear about what treatment you're thinking of, what is your formulation, what is your plan for, if you're thinking this might be the approach we want to take. This might be the EBP we would like to try, kind of laying that out for people in a very predictable way and saying, this is the expertise I come in with.
Yes.
And I'm open to hearing, I want to hear your experience. I'm open to hearing your experience. I haven't served, and I know that I may misstep, or I may, not understand something, and I'll ask you for clarification, but just being open, kind of like that. Does that make sense? Like kind of, just, conveying an openness to hearing their experience and making it sort of predictable about what you're hoping to achieve and kind of your thoughts on the treatment process. So it's a little more transparent for folks.
It's just so important too, because I think sometimes we feel like as providers, we have to know everything. We have to project this sense of expertise. We have to, make sure our clients get that we know what we're talking about. And it is really a different stance or a different approach to say, hey, you know what? I may make mistakes, right? I'm not sure that I know everything, and I'm going to need your help as an expert client, to help me to understand this too. And there's really nothing wrong with that. I think early on in my career, I remember thinking that I had to make sure I projected that they could trust what I was saying because I'm an expert, rather than being another human in the room with them,
Right.
I think that expert part, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, Kevin. That's the key piece that I like. Yes, you don't have to be expert in all aspects of it. Don't forget you are expert in what you're treating them for, right? Like I'm coming in as an expert on what PTSD is, how it affects people, how it might be impacting you, how we are going to get you better and take back that territory PTSD is taken from you. But you're coming in as the expert on your experience. You're the expert on how that's going to fit with this treatment. And we have to work collaboratively together with those two expertises to make this work. And I'm not going to, please, I'm not going to assume anything about that experience. That's where I'm going to need you to kind of work with me and collaborate. And I think that really diffuses that. But yeah, we don't have to know everything about, we don't need to understand every single acronym to be effective.
Wait, it's okay to ask, what does that mean?
Yeah. And I think it's a balance, right? Like we don't want our clients having to sit and explain everything and teach us, but at the same time, so we can do some legwork, but, don't fake it. I will say, if you don't know something, don't pretend you do either.
Right. I think people tend to see through that too, if you're trying to do that. And and that being said, like there are resources, right? So like there's no reason not to build questions into your intake that ask about military service, kind of where you served, for many reasons, to take history that can tell you, have they been exposed to health hazards, or have they, what were some of the experiences they could have had? And there's some templates for that we can talk about when we talk about resources too, that folks can take a look at.
That's awesome. Actually, and I think it's a good time, like, we've kind of set up the problem is that not many folks who are serving as behavioral health providers have personal, experience. So what do we do? How do we help providers get shored up in this area? And maybe kind of let's shift to, NCPTSD and the VA and obviously us and CDP, we've spent a ton of time trying to develop these products to support providers. What do you think are some important ones that could augment the work that folks are doing with their military connected clients?
And I'll mention before you get into listing them. I'm sorry. Yeah. I talked over you.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I will say before you get into listing them necessarily that we will include links and other ways that people can find these in the show notes. So, we'll ask you to provide those for us. We can attach those. So you don't necessarily have to try to spell out a URL. We'll have those available for folks who are listening.
Perfect. The first training that comes to mind is really that sort of seminal training that you and Dr. Watson had developed. I mean, I think that was at least the first I was aware of a training that went that in depth into military culture and aspects of treating military connected folks. And so I'm curious where that is in the process. Is that, and this can be off the record, but is that no longer at EBP?
No, it can be on the record. So we do, we'll link in the show notes that we do have a military culture tab on our website that has a bunch of different resources. So that link to that course is there. It is old enough now that there's sort of this discussion. It's kind of on pause in terms of being able to access it. Will it be updated or not? So I think for right now, it's not accessible. We do, which we'll put direct link to, have a shorter 2-hour version that's called Military Culture Enhancing Clinical Competence, that is on our website. It's a view only course right now. So if you're a provider out there who just wants to kind of get some information, digest some different aspects of branches of service, be thinking about warrior ethos and how that impacts somebody's way of viewing the world, and how mental health culture and military culture clash, all of those kinds of things are in that 2-hour view only training that will put a direct link to. But that's it was kind of the distilled down, digested Reader's Digest version of the very, very long. One of the problems with the other courses, it was quite long. It was 4 modules, 2 hours each. So that's 8 hours. So we wanted to create something that was more reasonable in terms of time. So that's still there. And you can access that on our website. And then there's other, there's obviously other courses out there, but the idea is there are courses to take, or on-demand things you can view. So that's one option. What else?
Yeah. I would say I should have mentioned this earlier, but around looking at one's own biases, potential biases around the military stereotypes, things like that these biases that you might have that you're not even aware of, right? Like Center for Deployment Psychology has a great assessment for that, right? That providers could take to really make them more aware of whether, they might have some stereotypes about the military, or kind of what their biases may be. And I think that self-awareness is also really important when you're going into the room with a patient.
It's a great first step for sure.
Yeah.
And we do, and we can put the link to that for sure too.
Right. And then there's some trainings that the VA has on VHA Train site, and there's specific ones. So there's a general kind of course, and there's also one for primary care in military culture, and one for spiritual care in military culture. And then there's also the community provider toolkit, which, thank you for all of your input over the years, Jenna, on content that's on that site as well.
So tell us more about the toolkit. And you're welcome.
So the toolkit was initially launched in 2012, also again quite long ago, and has undergone some revision, of course, since then. In particular, the military culture pages that we have on that toolkit have gone through some iterations, and that's primarily due to when we first launched the toolkit. We had thought, okay, well, it's important for people to take a history and to know where to find, links to the different branches of the military, things like that. And so we had that up there. And what we realized over the years was that you can give people a set of questions, right? But if they have no background, they don't really maybe know why they're asking all of these questions, right? Like they might not realize what's important about asking, what branch somebody served in, or what, or whatever particular question. And so when we went back to revise the site, we actually broadened the questions to have you or someone you love served in the military, and then tell me more about that. And we have different considerations for each question, right? Like, here's why this might be important. And then after that, we link to related trainings or websites that folks can learn more about that particular topic. And so it's a little bit different. And that piece was revised with help from yourself and Dr. Watson and folks at the VA, Dr. Loftus and Dr. Crow, and many, many VA staff and National Center staff have looked at that site over the years and provided feedback. And SAMHSA staff, we work a lot with partnerships on that website. So, but yeah, it's, hopefully helpful to folks in terms of finding specific trainings and things like that, and knowing maybe where to start. So we have a page for considerations in treating rural Alaska Native and American Indian veterans. We also have one for considerations for transgender folks and in treating LGBTQ plus folks as well, with links and resources specific to those topics. Yes, and just to mention too, the VA has a pocket card on their website that just goes down some questions to take for military history. It's a pocket card for taking a military history, and that can be useful as well. So.
Yeah, because I think
I'll
that
throw
goes
it back to you guys.
Yeah, no, and I think that goes back to, we're all well trained. If I'm assessing depression, I ask these things, or if I'm trying to take a social history, I ask these questions. But we don't have great resources for good to ask questions about military stuff. Like if you don't have experience with that. And I love that the toolkit takes the step further to sort of say the why behind the question, the intent behind it. And I think you also are pointing out, sort of this issue we've already talked about, that the military has a culture filled with subcultures. Right. Again, the experience of the larger military culture can be very different, based on cultural origin, but also, other features of the person or features of the job that you do in the military. And so, that again is not said to make it overwhelming, but just it brings it back to the, we talk about intersectionality in a lot of our trainings, and if you could see me, I'm drawing a circle in the air, but the individuals in the middle, but there's all those spokes coming out that are, different aspects of that person that really, it's not one of those exterior circles that shapes how they experience the world, but sort of all of them together. Some more, maybe more important at different times in somebody's life. But, again, I've mentioned, I was a female and I was Air Force and I have all my other features that sort of play into who I am and how I see the world and how I might see a provider or a treatment. And, that's really the crux of it, right? It's like, how are these things influencing how your client is viewing their problem, is viewing your work together, is, what expectations they have. And that's the important part of it. Kevin, were you going to say something?
No.
Okay. I thought I cut you off.
No. Well, I'm so glad you brought that up, Jen. Like, I think that's so important. The intersectionality piece of this, like, and recognizing these different pieces of identity that people come in with. I think that's so important.
Yeah. And not making assumptions about which one trumps another, right. Or overemphasizing one. Right. And, just because somebody served doesn't mean they really aligned with the military culture. For some people it's a great fit and they sort of take on characteristics of that. And for other people, it really wasn't. And, there's changes in that developmentally. So it's a really complex, fascinating part of clinical care and work. And I know, Kevin and I are both PE consultants, prolonged exposure consultants for CBP. And we really think about that a lot, how somebody's background and culture shapes even their experience of their trauma and, this treatment that we're trying to have them engage in. So it's such a critical part.
I'm curious if there's like major things that sort of you see again and again, or that kind of come up when you're doing these treatments, since you both do this so much. With the training.
I think in general, I mean, and I'll think of Kevin can maybe think of a specific example. One thing I think is important to foot stomp, and I alluded to it earlier, is the military culture. Yeah. If you took military culture and you kind of lined up its features and you put mental health culture and you lined up its features next to each other, they're almost diametrically opposed. Like our cultures could not be more different. Right. Military is about pain tolerance. We're about this, we're about, kind of reducing distress. There's, we want you to open up and feel and talk, and that's not always adaptive in the military. So I think one thing we see sometimes with our consultation is providers coming at their patients really only from this mental health culture lens. And it's almost like they're fighting their client, they're not understanding, they're not putting the behaviors they're seeing in the context of, this was really adaptive for me when I was in the military and it's how I operate. Right. And so figuring out ways to kind of move over to the military culture initially, like don't drag them over to mental health culture, don't kind of understand where that's coming from. And then, continue to talk about how that's serving them and kind of shifting them slowly over to some of the things and individual goals versus, it's all about, individual goals in therapy and like what you want to get versus like, what does the unit need? What does the military need?
Right. I mean, if there's any specific example, that's one I was thinking of. It's just, sometimes clients that I've worked with before, when we've talked about things that start sounding like self-actualization or something like that, right? Like, what do you need? What do you want? What would be beneficial for you? I get a lot of, or I have had it in the past, at least some military clients that'll push back and say, well, no, I mean, we need to get the mission done. Like it's my contribution to this group goal. And, for example, Jenna alluded to earlier, some of those things that people have heard in therapy or from other providers that were not helpful, and one example of there that just, when I said I felt called out, I know I've said this before. It's like, well, wouldn't you rather not be over there? Wouldn't you rather, isn't it better for you not to be deployed? No, not necessarily. Coming from a mental health culture perspective only, okay, sure, because that means you can focus on you. But one of the things that I learned, and I think a lot of us learn as we're working with service connected folks, is that there's also this high value placed on contributing to this group, like doing this job that you trained for, and even feeling at times guilty if things happen when you weren't there, because you weren't there to contribute, to be part of that team, and recognizing that, understanding that as a true deep value for some of these folks helps us understand our clients better. I mean, just as one specific example. Exactly.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Not telling that value is maladaptive or that's what's causing their problems. Not at all. That's kind of part of, the culture they're coming from and with. So,
Another example that's an easy one too is, and I'll use PE because we that's what I'm most familiar with these days. We give rationales, right? We give these long rationales for treatment, a rationale for in vivo, a rationale for imaginal. And providers, I think, sometimes forget to check in the right way to check understanding. So again, like if they're working with a service member, or does this treatment sound good to you? Yes, ma'am. Right. That's going to be the answer versus I just explained a lot. Some of this treatment can be tough. What parts are you most concerned about? That was a lot of information. Tell me the pieces that feel the least clear. So you're like forcing that. It's okay to question this. It's okay to have concerns about what I'm asking you to do. And you don't just need to say, yes, ma'am. So I think that it can play out that way too. And then, treatment doesn't progress because the client doesn't understand the why behind why they're doing it, but they don't want to ask you because that's, rude or inappropriate for them to do.
Right. Yeah. And as much as we may not like it, we may be perceived as an authority figure. And, when you're coming from a hierarchical structure, and your authority figure saying, we're going to do this. You don't need to know the why. That they might interpret that differently than we might think we're saying it as mental health providers.
Sure. Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. When you were talking about the group and contributions to the group, I guess distally related, in talking to college students, right, who are veterans, who recently transitioned out of the military, it just reminded me of when they would talk about group work and how as a non-traditional student right there, they would end up often, and as a veteran, often picking up the slack for their group members who wouldn't do as much prep work or as much work on the project. But
because we got to get the mission done. Right. It's not
right.
It's not just the individual, but yeah.
Exactly. It's about the teamwork, right? Yeah.
Well, so just as we wrap up any of our episodes, this is practical for your practice. We like to ask anybody who's joining us, like, what kind of specific practical tips do you have for our listeners as they're thinking about, starting their journey or continuing their journey and developing their, cultural sensitivity or cultural competence for military culture? Like, what are some of those tips that some of our listeners can take right now, go apply and improve their cultural competence for military culture?
So, I think, one thing that I might do first is start to look at your own biases around military service and service members. And you can find that checklist, right, at EBP. And it's short and you can, it just might help make you a little bit more self-aware. I think that's always great to increase our awareness as clinicians of our own perspectives and views. And then, there is a number of trainings out there that you can check out and get some background in military culture. And also, like I mentioned, there's also some places where you might find questions that you can build into your intake, and that might give you a sense of, this person's been exposed to this situation or this potential hazard, or they might need this referral for multidisciplinary care, right? And it might give you some leads on where to refer them or to connect them to other support services that they might need. That's.
I think those are great. The other one I would add, Shannon, and see if you agree, is consultation too. Like, this is a place in clinical care where it's okay definitely to get consultation, whether that's through VA or it's through us. Don't worry alone. So I love the idea of, like, here's the self work you could do, right? Use these resources, do the work on your biases. We all have them. It's okay, but if you're aware of them, you don't bring them into the room as often. And get the information from the courses. And again, luckily there's lots of free resources out there on this front. Build those resources into your practice. And I will mention, with the military culture big course we did, we developed something called the culturally competent behaviors checklist. And that's kind of like looking at your practice. What are things you're already doing? Where are some things you could and it's everything from, like, adding certain questions to your intake forms, asking the question, first of all, looking at your waiting room, looking at your office space, not that you have to have flags and patriotic things, but are there any aspects of what's in your space that might be off-putting? Are you offering telehealth? If that's something that you think would draw in this population. So just take a look at your clinical practice, which kind of goes with your point about, what kinds of things can you add to your questionnaires or intake process, and then consult, hey, I've got this client and I'm doing this EBP and this is coming up, I'm trying to understand in the context of culture, or there's cultural factors I'm missing, or, ways I'm misinterpreting this. And don't worry alone, get some support from folks who spend a lot of time thinking about this, care passionately about it. And I think that would be just one more thing I'd add.
As a previous supervisor used to say to me, is spread the liability around, right?
But I mean, it's that way, but.
Well, within that, just following up on that, I would say there's also the PTSD consultation program, right? Through the VA. And I think one of your previous guests came on to talk about that, I think, right? So Dr. Norman.
Yes. And we can put, again, all these resources in the show notes. So people don't have to go hunting through an old episode, but yes, please say more about that. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no. So the PTSD consultation program is, anyone in the community or, at the VA or wherever, if they're seeing a veteran who has PTSD or trauma symptoms, they can call the consultation program and receive expert consultation on the case, which is super helpful. And then there's also the Make the Connection website on the VA that the VA runs. And the Make the Connection website has stories of real veterans telling their stories and how, they reached out and sought care or got connected to care resources. And there's a provider option on that page too. So that has a bunch of resources there. And the National Center for PTSD has a similar site called About Faith that has veterans with PTSD talking about their journey and their care that they received. So those are some really good sites to check out.
Yeah,
those are great.
I keep thinking, where were these resources a million years ago when I was an intern? But
I know
it's such good ones.
We've learned from all of your mistakes, Kevin. It's okay.
Right.
Well,
you have
Shannon, I do.
Now, Kevin.
Exactly. Right. Don't do this. Don't do that. Shannon, I do want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and talk through the importance of military culture and how to shore up your what you need to know about military culture. And I look forward to many projects to come with you. And hopefully we can continue to develop some tools for providers on this front moving forward. But we are really grateful. So thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me on. It was a lot of fun, and I look forward to future projects too. There's a lot of work to do. So
for sure.
So yeah. All right.
Well,
Great.
Thanks, everyone. We hope to
thank you
next time on Practical for Your Practice.
I do want to mention one new resource for the podcast that you all, we talked to you for 3 seasons now, and you've heard a lot of different guests, a lot of different tips and practical tools you can use. We want to hear from you. What are your questions? What are the things that you're encountering? What's your reactions to, previous guests? Or do you have suggestions for future topics? Give us a call and leave us a voice message. We have a new service through SpeakPipe. So it's at speakpipe.com/CDPP4P. So that's Center for Deployment Psychology, Practical for Your Practice. Speakpipe.com/CDPP4P, and leave us a voicemail, and you may be featured in a future podcast episode.
Thanks for listening to Practical for Your Practice.
Please feel free to subscribe, rate, and join in on the conversation in the comments.
Until next time.